Ethan Blackwell stood tall in the center of his Manhattan penthouse, surveying the extravagant party spread out before him. The sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter filled the air as his guests indulged in the luxury only he could provide. He was the picture of success, a billionaire at the top of his game. With money, power, and influence at his fingertips, there was nothing more he could want. Yet, as he gazed over the room, a feeling of emptiness lingered, just out of reach but unmistakable. He had everything, and yet it wasn't enough. His longtime friend, Alexander Reed, leaned casually against the bar, watching Ethan with a half-smile, a knowing gleam in his eye. They had been friends for years, each of them playing their part in the high-stakes world of business and wealth. But tonight, Alexander wasn't content with simply enjoying the party. He was here to provoke. "You look bored, Ethan," Alexander remarked, a hint of mischief in his voice. "It must be tough, being at the top of the world and having nothing left to conquer." Ethan turned his gaze toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you getting at, Alex?" "Oh, nothing," Alexander said, swirling his drink thoughtfully. "It's just, you've played every game there is to play, haven't you? The stock market, the real estate deals, the social circles. There's nothing left but the same old routine." Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking toward the lavish decorations around them. He had built his empire from the ground up, every achievement a testament to his unmatched ability to control his world. But Alexander had a point. His life had become predictable, and no amount of wealth or power could break that monotony. Alexander's voice broke the silence. "What if I gave you a real challenge, one that was completely out of your league?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "And what exactly did you have in mind?" Alexander smirked, leaning in closer. "I bet you can't marry a woman who is nothing like the women you usually go for. No fancy socialite, no model, no woman who is dazzled by your wealth. Marry someone completely outside your world, someone who doesn't care about status, money, or what you can offer. Do it for 6 months. No strings attached. Just a simple contract." Ethan's expression remained unchanged as he processed the words. Marry someone outside his world? It was absurd, of course. He was a man who commanded respect, who was accustomed to choosing the finest women, the most elegant companions. The idea of marrying someone who didn't fit his carefully curated lifestyle seemed ludicrous. But there was something about the challenge that piqued his interest. It wasn't about the woman herself. It was about proving that he could control even the most impossible situations. "I'm listening," Ethan finally said, his voice low and steady. "I thought you might be," Alexander replied, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "The bet is simple. Find a woman who is nothing like you. Marry her, live with her for 6 months, and then let's see if you can still have everything you want when she's not playing by your rules." Ethan's lips curled into a confident smile. 6 months, huh? I'm sure I can manage. But what do I get out of it? Alexander leaned back, savoring the moment. The satisfaction of winning, of course. Plus, I'll throw in a little something extra. Your choice of any business deal, any merger, anything you desire. But you'll need to succeed in this challenge first. Ethan's mind raced, but his decision was already made. This was a game, and he always played to win. "You're on," he said, extending his hand. And just like that, the wager was set. The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of research and strategy. Ethan scoured through endless profiles, looking for the woman who would fit Alexander's criteria. She had to be nothing like the women who flitted in and out of his life. Women who were always chasing after his wealth, his status. She had to be strong, independent, and entirely unimpressed by his world. After hours of sorting through names and faces, he found her. Isabel Thompson, a 36-year-old social worker with a curvy figure, a fiercely independent nature, and a deep dedication to her work with underprivileged families. She was the complete opposite of the women Ethan was used to. She wasn't interested in his wealth, his name, or the glamour of his lifestyle. She was the perfect choice, the ideal candidate to prove his control over any situation. But as Ethan researched further, something caught his eye. Isabel wasn't just any social worker. She had founded a charity, Helping Hands, focused on providing support for families struggling to make ends meet. Her passion for her work was evident in every interview, every article, every picture he found. She wasn't just a woman who lived in the shadows of others. She was a force of her own, and that made her all the more intriguing. Without hesitation, Ethan made the call. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't one to waste time. When Isabel answered the phone, her voice was calm and professional, but Ethan could hear the strength behind it. "This is Isabel Thompson. How may I help you?" "I'm Ethan Blackwell," he said smoothly, "and I have an offer that I think you'll find very interesting." The proposal was simple enough. A marriage contract that would provide significant funding for Isabel's charity in exchange for 6 months of her life as his wife. There were no strings attached beyond the legal contract, no emotional ties, no expectations beyond what was stipulated in the agreement. It was a business deal, and Isabel had a hard time resisting. Her charity was in dire need of funding, and this offer could change everything. But there was a catch. Ethan's reputation preceded him. He was known for being cold, calculating, and, most importantly, controlling. The idea of marrying someone like him, a man who could buy anything and anyone, was not something she was particularly keen on. Still, after much deliberation, Isabel decided to take the offer, though not without reservations. When the day of the wedding arrived, it was a spectacle beyond her wildest imagination. The ceremony was lavish, the guest list was exclusive, and Ethan stood at the altar, his piercing eyes never leaving hers. Isabel couldn't help but feel out of place in the sea of glimmering chandeliers and expensive suits. But as she exchanged vows with a man she barely knew, she reminded herself that this was for the greater good. After the wedding, Isabel moved into Ethan's penthouse, but there was no warmth, no sense of intimacy. She refused to share a bedroom with him, keeping a clear distance. Ethan's world was foreign to her, a place where the only things that mattered were money, appearances, and status. She wasn't interested in any of it. Ethan, on the other hand, was fascinated by her resistance. His wealth, his control, had always been enough to bend people to his will. But Isabel was different. She was unmoved by his riches, uninterested in his power. It both frustrated and intrigued him in ways he couldn't understand. He had never encountered someone who refused to be molded into his world. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized that winning this game might not be as simple as he thought. Days passed, and the cold distance between Ethan and Isabel remained unbroken. While Ethan attended his usual round of high-powered meetings and business events, Isabel immersed herself in her charity work, focusing entirely on Helping Hands, a community center she had established to aid struggling families. Despite their contract, their worlds remained divided, each living in their own bubble of priorities and expectations. Isabel invited Ethan to visit the center, though she had little hope that he would understand the true purpose of the work. She wasn't expecting a grand gesture or even a genuine interest, just a small token of effort on his part. To her surprise, Ethan agreed. The moment they arrived at the community center, Ethan felt a profound unease wash over him. It wasn't the glimmering world of luxury and power that he had been accustomed to. The building was modest, the air filled with the laughter of children and the soft conversations of parents who looked worn but hopeful. The smells of home-cooked meals and the sounds of busy workers filled the space, and it felt foreign to Ethan. He could tell that people weren't in awe of him. They didn't care who he was, what his bank account looked like, or the luxury of his penthouse. They cared about survival. They cared about getting through another day. Isabel led him through the center, showing him the various programs they offered. She introduced him to single mothers struggling to make ends meet, children who came to receive tutoring, and volunteers working tirelessly to provide support. There was no glitz, no glamour, just real, raw need. As he listened to the stories of families fighting to keep their heads above water, Ethan felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. He tried to keep his composure, but something inside him was shifting. The luxury he was used to felt meaningless here. He had always believed that success was a direct result of hard work, that wealth was simply the reward for playing the game right. But this world, Isabel's world, taught him something different. It wasn't just about effort. It was about opportunity. It was about being given a chance. As they moved through the center, Isabel spoke with passion about the programs they offered: mentorship, food assistance, childcare. but it was clear that every inch of this place was funded through hard work, donations, and personal sacrifice. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if he used his wealth to make a real difference instead of lining his pockets with even more luxury. He had always prided himself on his self-made fortune, but in this moment, his empire seemed so small in comparison to what Isabel was building, a legacy of giving. In the weeks that followed, Ethan tried to integrate Isabel into his world, inviting her to charity galas and business functions that catered to the elite. He hoped that she would learn to play by the rules, to adapt to the superficial social world he was used to. Maybe, he thought, this would be the bridge to get closer to her, even if it was just for the sake of the bet. But Isabel wasn't impressed. She wasn't interested in the million-dollar suits, the gold-plated awards, or the whispered conversations about power plays in the boardroom. To her, these events were nothing more than a display of shallow excess. She spoke her mind freely, criticizing the charity galas for being little more than self-congratulatory affairs where people spent millions of dollars to pat themselves on the back for doing something they would never truly understand. One evening, at a lavish charity ball hosted by one of Ethan's most influential clients, Isabel didn't hold back. As they mingled with the guests, she turned to Ethan, her voice cutting through the pretentious air. This is exactly what's wrong with the way people view charity. It's not about the prestige or the event, Ethan. It's about making a real difference in someone's life, not just handing out a check to make yourself feel better. Ethan was taken aback. He had spent so many years in this world that he had never considered it from her perspective. For him, charity was about recognition, both for the donors and for the people receiving help. But Isabel's words hit him harder than he expected. "What would you suggest?" Ethan asked, his voice more thoughtful than defensive. "Simple," she replied, her eyes unwavering. "Real change starts with listening, with understanding, with doing something that actually helps people, not just flaunting your wealth in their face." Her words stung, but deep down, he knew she was right. The uncomfortable truth was that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who praised his every move but never questioned whether he was actually making a difference. Isabel had shattered that illusion. It wasn't long before Ethan found himself spending more time at Isabel's community center, though initially, it was out of a sense of duty. He wanted to show Isabel that he could still play the game of business while supporting her cause. But as the days went by, something inside him began to change. He couldn't shake the images of the families, the single mothers, the children who had so little but gave so much of themselves. Ethan watched as Isabel tirelessly worked to improve the lives of others. She spent hours organizing food drives, managing volunteers, and meeting with community leaders to find solutions to ongoing struggles. There was no room for ego here. There was no room for pretense. It was all about real, raw effort, and Isabel was at the heart of it all. One afternoon, he was introduced to a young mother named Maria, who had just given birth to a baby girl. Maria had been living in her car for the past week after losing her job and her apartment. With no family nearby, she had nowhere to turn. Isabel had arranged for her to stay at the center for the time being, but it was clear that her future was uncertain. As Ethan watched Maria hold her newborn, the desperation in her eyes was enough to break even his hardened heart. He could feel the weight of her fear, her helplessness, and it triggered something in him that he hadn't felt in years: empathy. He wasn't used to feeling this kind of emotion. He had always kept his distance from anything that made him uncomfortable, but Maria's situation forced him to confront a side of life he had long ignored. "Is there anything we can do to help her?" Ethan asked Isabel quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel looked at him, surprised by the genuine concern in his tone. "We'll do everything we can," she said softly, "but it's going to take more than just a handout. It's about giving her the support she needs to rebuild her life." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt compelled to do something more than just write a check. He wanted to help, to make a real difference. And as he looked at Isabel, something inside him began to shift. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he was no longer the man he once was. Ethan's transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. He had spent years building his empire, surrounded by luxury and excess. But as he spent more time at Isabel's community center, he started to see things differently. He saw the families struggling to survive, the kids trying to escape the cycle of poverty, and Isabel, who gave her all every day to make a difference. The more he learned, the more he wanted to do. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was actively participating. One day, Isabel introduced Ethan to a local business owner who had recently lost his job due to the economic downturn. The man had a family to support but no prospects for work. Isabel had been helping him with resume writing, job search assistance, and food donations, but it wasn't enough. The man needed a real chance, an opportunity to rebuild his life. Without thinking, Ethan stepped in. He called in a favor from one of his high-powered business contacts and arranged a job interview for the man at one of his companies. The result was a job offer, a lifeline for the struggling family. When Isabel found out, she was surprised. It wasn't just the act of charity that shocked her. It was the genuine concern Ethan had shown for someone he barely knew. "You didn't have to do that," Isabel said quietly, the disbelief in her voice impossible to ignore. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice soft but resolute. "But I wanted to. This feels right. It's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about giving people the tools to build a better future." Isabel studied him for a moment, her skepticism fading. She had always seen Ethan as someone who cared only for appearances, for the game of wealth and power. But now, she was beginning to see a different side of him. The man who had once been lost in the superficial world of billion-dollar deals was now trying to make a meaningful difference. Still, she was cautious. Was this real? Or was Ethan just trying to prove something to her? Only time would tell. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued to immerse himself in Isabel's world. But despite the progress he had made, a deep feeling of emptiness lingered inside him. He had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, influence. But something was missing. The more time he spent with Isabel, the more he realized that his life had been built on the wrong foundation. One evening, after a long day at the community center, Ethan found himself sitting with Isabel on the steps outside the building, the evening sky stretching above them. The air was cool, and the streetlights flickered softly in the distance. They had just finished a community event, and both were exhausted but content. Ethan took a deep breath and finally spoke the words he had been holding inside for weeks. "Isabel, I need to be honest with you," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I've spent my whole life believing that money could buy everything: success, happiness, respect. But I've never been happy. Not really. I've built this empire, but it's just a house of cards." Isabel's gaze softened, though her guard remained up. "Ethan, I've been wrong," he interrupted, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought that if I had everything, I'd be fulfilled. But all this," he gestured toward the city skyline, "it's meaningless. I've spent years chasing the wrong things, and now I'm starting to understand what really matters." For the first time, Isabel saw vulnerability in Ethan, true vulnerability. He wasn't the cold, calculated businessman she had thought him to be. He was just a man who had been lost, trying to find his way. His confession wasn't just about his wealth or his past. It was about the realization that his entire worldview had been shattered, piece by piece, as he spent time in Isabel's world. Isabel was quiet for a long time, processing his words. She had always seen Ethan as a man who used his wealth to shield himself from the real world. But now, she saw someone who was beginning to tear down those walls. She wanted to believe him, but the doubts lingered. Could someone change that much in such a short time? As Ethan and Isabel began to navigate their evolving relationship, an unexpected visitor arrived: Julian. He had been Ethan's childhood friend and business partner, a man who had always been a shadow in the background. When he entered the community center, there was an air of tension that none of them could ignore. Julian wasted no time in revealing the truth. "I'm sure you've been wondering why Ethan has been acting so different lately," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, there's a reason. You see, it's all part of a bet." Isabel's heart sank as the truth hit her like a slap to the face. The bet, the challenge. Everything had been a game to Ethan. He hadn't truly changed. He had been playing her the entire time. All the progress, all the emotions, everything they had shared. It had been part of his game to prove a point. She felt sick to her stomach as she stared at Ethan, the man who had seemed so real, so sincere. "No," Isabel whispered, her voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "This wasn't real. You never cared." Ethan's face fell, his worst fear realized in an instant. "Isabel, please. I never meant for this to happen. I never intended for you to get hurt." But Isabel couldn't listen anymore. The truth was out, and it was clear that everything they had built was nothing more than a lie. She stood up abruptly, her emotions too raw to hide. "You've wasted enough of my time, Ethan," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I can't be part of this anymore." Without another word, Isabel walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the dim light of the community center parking lot. In that moment, he realized the depth of his mistake. He had lost more than just Isabel. He had lost himself in the process. The game he had been playing, the world he had built, had all come crashing down around him. And now, there was nothing left but the wreckage. As Isabel disappeared into the night, Ethan was left to face the consequences of his actions, consequences he could never undo. Days passed, but Ethan couldn't escape the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at him. Every thought, every moment, was consumed by his betrayal of Isabel. He had built his empire on lies and manipulation, and now he had ruined the one thing that had ever truly mattered. His chance to change, to be with her. His business seemed irrelevant now. The luxuries he once craved felt hollow. The grand penthouse that had once symbolized success now felt like a prison. In an attempt to make amends, Ethan returned to the Rise Up Community Center. He had avoided it since the day Isabel left, ashamed of his actions. But he couldn't ignore the calling inside him anymore. He needed to prove to Isabel and to himself that he could change, that he wasn't the man he had once been. He arrived at the center early in the morning, before anyone else was there. The building was quiet, but as he walked through the hallways, he saw the marks of the real work that Isabel had been doing. The chalkboards filled with lessons, the volunteers preparing meals for families, the children's artwork on the walls. This was the life Isabel had dedicated herself to, real, raw, meaningful. Ethan stood still for a moment, reflecting on everything he had seen, everything he had come to understand. He had been living a life of shadows, pretending that success and wealth were all that mattered. But in truth, it was moments like these, the small, powerful acts of kindness, that created real change. He knew what he had to do. He picked up the phone and contacted his company's financial team. He made arrangements for a large donation to the center, enough to ensure its survival and growth. But this time, it wasn't about making him look good. It was about supporting the real work Isabel had started. He wasn't doing this to win her back, not directly. He was doing it because he now saw the power of giving, not just in terms of money, but in genuine effort. Isabel had given him a glimpse of a world beyond himself, and he wanted to be a part of it, not as a philanthropist trying to make his image better, but as someone who truly wanted to help. Days later, Ethan heard back from Isabel. She agreed to meet him, under no illusions, no promises. She wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but she was willing to listen. As they sat together, Ethan felt a shift in him, a recognition that whatever happened from this point on, he had to be true to himself. He couldn't continue pretending. He couldn't play the game anymore. "I made a mistake," he told her, his voice steady but sincere. "I hurt you, and for that, I am truly sorry. I wasn't playing this game for the right reasons. But I can't undo the past. All I can do is show you that I've changed, and I want to prove that to you." Isabel looked at him for a long time, weighing his words before responding softly. "You've done more for this center in a week than I've seen some people do in a lifetime. But that doesn't erase the past. I need time to believe you." Ethan nodded. It was a start. It wasn't a happy ending, not yet, but it was a chance to rebuild, a chance to prove that change was possible. Weeks passed, and while Isabel remained distant, Ethan didn't give up. He continued his work with Rise Up, not as a way to win her back, but because he believed in the center's mission. He was determined to show the world, that he could be more than just a rich businessman. Every day, he showed up, not as the man he once was, but as someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. Isabel watched him from afar, her skepticism slowly beginning to fade. She saw how committed he was, not just to the center but to the people it helped. His involvement wasn't superficial. He wasn't just throwing money around. He was rolling up his sleeves, working with the families, meeting the children, listening to their stories. His actions spoke louder than any words he could say. But even as she began to see his transformation, Isabel struggled with her feelings. She had been hurt by him, betrayed in a way that was hard to forget. Trust was not something she could give easily. Yet, there was something about Ethan that was different now. A vulnerability, an honesty that she hadn't seen before. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but she couldn't ignore the changes in him. One afternoon, as they sat in the community center office together, discussing new initiatives for the center, Isabel looked at Ethan and saw not the billionaire, but the man he had become. He had given up so much of his world for this cause, for her, and she couldn't deny the shift within herself. The man who had once been a cold, calculated tycoon was now a man she could respect. The seeds of forgiveness were being planted, though Isabel wasn't sure if she was ready to let them grow. The day of the charity gala arrived, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't worried about the event itself. The spotlight, the recognition, the media attention, they no longer mattered. What mattered was Isabel and the work they had done together. He had grown to care for her deeply, not because of the bet, not because of a challenge, but because of who she was. She had opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed, and in doing so, she had changed him in ways he hadn't even realized were possible. Isabel arrived at the gala, dressed in an elegant gown, her usual calm confidence now tempered with a new understanding. She had forgiven him, slowly, cautiously, but she had forgiven him. The man before her wasn't the same man who had walked into her life all those months ago. And while their future was still uncertain, she knew that they had both come a long way. Their journey wasn't over yet, but it was no longer defined by a bet or by what they stood to gain. It was defined by what they could give and by the bond they had created, one act of kindness at a time. As the evening progressed, Ethan stood by her side, no longer as a businessman with something to prove, but as a man who had found something far more valuable than wealth. Isabel turned to him and, with a soft smile, said, "You've come a long way, Ethan, but you don't have to prove anything to me anymore." Ethan smiled back, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had come a long way, indeed, but he knew now that the most important part of the journey was just beginning. As the night drew to a close, he took Isabel's hand, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that spoke volumes. "I don't need to prove anything," he said, "but I do need to tell you, I love you, not because of the bet, or because of anything else. I love you for you." Isabel's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, she let her guard down. "Then prove it," she whispered. Her heart finally opened to the possibility of something real, something lasting. And as they stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the lives they had touched together, both of them knew that their love wasn't defined by a bet. It was something far more profound, something that had been built on trust, change, and a shared vision of a better world. The future was theirs to create, and for the first time, they were ready to embrace it. Thank you for following this story all the way to the end. Ethan and Isabel's journey was not just about love, but also about growth, redemption, and the power of kindness. I hope this story has brought you moments of inspiration and emotion. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more captivating stories, and comment your thoughts below. Your support means the world and motivates me to create even better content. See you in the next story.